looking at how the world sort of looks at women and their roles in society, I realized that that inequality was a fundamental part of the way in which society was organized. And I was curious about it. What causes this gender inequality, and what contributes to the fact that women face many more barriers than men do.
This is The Head of the Table. I am Nora Riddle. I'm your host. I'm a former policy advisor, former chief of staff in corporate America, and your advisor on all things leadership. And today is a guest episode. I really wanted to take a minute to step back and kind of talk about what we're going to be discussing with our guests today. And that is women's economic empowerment and women's empowerment overall. Women's empowerment is an imperative, and we've talked a little bit about it on this podcast, but it really is important because when women succeed, we all succeed, both economically and we bring in a more stable world. And so today, to kind of talk about women's empowerment and the many years she spent working on this issue is former Ambassador Rao Gupta. I'd love to have you introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Nora, for inviting me. My name is Geeta Rao Gupta. I am spent in my entire professional career working on women's rights and gender equality and women's empowerment. Started my career in India as an academic. I was a lecturer, and then moved into Women in Development, which is essentially women's contributions to development, and had the opportunity in this country to work in both nonprofits as well as philanthropy and multilateral organizations, and most recently in government as the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues in the Department of State, which was a true honor. So through all of that, the common thread has been my advocacy, research, and activism around women's rights and gender equality.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really such an honor. I'm honored that I got the opportunity to work with you while I was at the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, and I'm honored that we get to work together in a new way.
I'm so amazed that you've set up this podcast. It's amazingly entrepreneurial and a fun way for us to chat now.
Thank you. It's a long time in the making. But I wanted to kick it off today to kind of ask you, how did you first get involved in women's empowerment and women's rights work?
So I grew up in India, as I said, and my family was extremely progressive. I grew up amidst women who were professional, strong women with views of their own that they had no hesitation in expressing, and men who supported them. So my family was a progressive, equitable family. And it took me a while. It was only when I was in college that I realized that all my peers didn't have the same experience, and they didn't have the same freedoms and opportunities as I had. And that puzzled me a little. And as I looked around where I was growing up, including my own experiences, in the outside world, looking at how the world sort of looks at women and their roles in society, I realized that that inequality was a fundamental part of the way in which society was organized. And I was curious about it. What causes this gender inequality, and what contributes to the fact that women face many more barriers than men do in sort of accessing economic opportunities or staying safe in society. And so that's what was sort of the question with which I entered my academic studies, and it sort of guided my career throughout.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I definitely, someone who grew up in Texas and had many strong women leading her life and her family, kind of going back generations. It's really inspirational because I think so many people, don't necessarily have those opportunities, and hearing that, other people can access that, other people have had these experiences, and they should have the opportunity too is really important.
Yes, I was actually a third generation a woman working outside the home. Even my grandma ran a school of her own for kids in her neighborhood. So, not being employed outside the home, not being independent was looked down upon, if anything, in my family. So it was the reverse. So it was a good environment to grow up in and to build my confidence.
Yeah. Would you say having so many driven women in your family really drove you to pursue women's rights work and the things that you've accomplished in your career?
I think I could have chosen any line of work. I think the message they gave me was that literally the world was my oyster and I could pick and choose whatever I wanted to do. So I'm not so sure that their professional choices led me in this direction. My mother was a physician and a public health specialist. My aunt, who's the other huge influence in my life, her sister, was a demographer, but also an actress on stage and managed both careers throughout her life. And so, it's more that if we were to define them today, we'd call them feminists. They didn't use the word then, but because they were such strong supporters of social justice and equality, not just between women and men, but across caste and class and all the other ways in which, society divides itself up and creates hierarchies. And so that's what I saw, and that's what I imbibed and wanted to pursue a career that had social justice as its goal.
I really like how you phrase that, of maybe they wouldn't identify as feminists, but it really is what we call feminism now.
Yeah, it's the values. It's the values that you hold, right? Feminism is really about the values for accountability, justice, freedom, and equality. And in this particular case, feminism refers to equality between women and men, but across a bunch of other intersecting axes of disadvantage, right? So whether that's class or race or caste or income, all of those things make a difference too.
Yeah, and I really like to think of the word of like intersectionality of like, I think about it of kind of like a stoplight or like a stop sign of like, it's just like where two roads cross, like it's just where two issues happen to cross.
Its identities are multiple, right?
Exactly.
So your identity is defined not just by whether you're male or female, woman or man, but also by what class you belong to, what religion you are, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the fact that we understand the multiplicity of identities in order to truly understand where someone is located in a society is extremely important.
Well, that kind of brings us to the next stage of our conversation, which I'm really excited to get into. I know around the world, we're kind of seeing this backlash against women's rights, girls' rights, from reproductive rights to workplace equality to access to education. How do you interpret that backlash?
So, I mean, the short answer to that is backlash comes when you have succeeded. So I feel like the women's movement and the sort of the overall global movement to achieve gender equality has existed for more than, I would say, 50, 60 years now. But the way in which the United Nations sort of contributed to that global momentum to discuss the issue was through UN conferences that occurred every 5 years initially, leading right up to the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, where 189 countries signed on to a platform for action, which laid out a bunch of issues, and that was in 1995. Even then, climate change and environment were mentioned as issues that were relevant for women. So just to say that the fact that we achieved that over that period of time, the first conference was in Mexico in 1975. You should know, Nora, that I graduated from college in 1975. So for me, the announcement of the International Year of Women in 1975, the first conference in Mexico City, and the fact that it was also announced at that time by the UN that this would be the International Decade of Women, influenced a lot of how I began to see the world, and I felt motivated by all of that to belong to this movement that was larger than India, to fight, to sort of make the case for women's rights. Anyway, I've wandered off the question I was talking about. But what was the question? I'm going to ask you again.
The question was, how do you interpret this backlash?
Yes. So the fact is that the success of Beijing is what created the backlash. In fact, if you look at the research that's done by the European Parliamentary Forum, which is a nonprofit based in Europe, as well as the Global Philanthropy Project based here in the US, you'll see that the attempt to try and undermine what we had achieved began almost immediately after Beijing. And it was funded, very well funded, very well networked, very well coordinated over the years. And that resulted in very strategic efforts to change the messaging, to change the sort of the ideas that were put out there for women's role in society. And what we're facing right now is a very determined effort to undermine women's rights. It's, usually we focus on women's reproductive rights because that's where it began. But now it's about women's role in society. You've heard about trad wives and the fear of trying to sort of convince women to have more babies because there's low fertility. So it's sort of resulted in an effort to reverse all of the gains that we've made over the decades. And that's really frightening. One of the things that I saw when I was in office in government was when I travel, I'd meet with parliamentarians, women in the media, who would tell me that they would never recommend to younger women that to follow in their footsteps and to take these kinds of public-facing jobs. And the reason for that is because of the enormous violence that they experienced online, which were threats to their children, to their lives, to their reputations, the doxing, the sort of deep fakes, all of that, which somehow we have been unable to regulate and control. But that's all part of this larger effort to undermine women's rights and keep them out of positions of leadership and power, because when you do that, you ultimately undermine democracy. And according to me, the forces that have gathered to become what we are now calling the anti-rights, anti-human rights effort have recognized that when you harm women's rights, when you undermine women's rights, you are actually undermining democracy. Because if more than half a population of a country cannot participate actively in civic and political life, you have a situation where the democracy cannot thrive. So democracies are dependent on women's full participation. And so I think the effort is really by authoritarian governments, leaders, a whole bunch of different actors who've come together, is to undermine democracy, and they see women's rights and gender equality as the weakest link.
I think that's really, really well put. And it kind of ties back to an earlier episode of this podcast where we kind of look at economic inclusion and inclusion in institutions and why that matters.
Yes.
Which is, it feels silly to almost have a conversation about it. You would think it would be inherent. But what I really liked about that episode is that there was actually some economists last year who won the Nobel Prize for economics. And when we look at the longevity of our institutions, whether economic or political, the longevity is dependent on inclusion, and that's inherent to kind of the human brain, how humans operate, of when you feel you have a stake in the game, when you feel you are part of a community, you are going to be more actively participating in that. Whether that means you feel like you can go out and have a career, whether that means you can go and vote, you can go and be part of a political system. Maybe you're, supporting a representative, you are a representative. And I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind as we kind of look at power dynamics. Because, if you are someone who is focused on control, you're not really focused on longevity. You're focused on, can I have power? How long can I have that power right now, immediate?
Yeah, it is. After all, gender inequality is because of an imbalance of power between women and men. And power in society is defined by access to certain key resources. Income, jobs are one, property is another, information, education, social networks, voice, having an ability to speak up. All of that determines the power that you have in any society. And if that is unequally distributed to women as compared to men, that's what is the basis for that inequality.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think that that balance means some people have lack of power.
Yeah, they think it's a zero-sum game, which it's not. And this is a case I've made repeatedly over the years, which is that if you increase women's access to resources and opportunities, you actually expand the pie for everybody. You increase opportunity and resources for all. And there's a lot of evidence proving that to be true, where women's income, women's empowerment influences family well-being, community well-being, and ultimately national economies and national stability and peace. So there's no downside to investing in women, according to me.
Yeah, I like to think of it instead of, we have a pie and we're welcoming people to have a slice, I like to think of it as we have a fund for pie. And if we invite more people, we have more money to get a bigger pie.
There you go. That's a great analogy.
Which, as someone who loves pie, I would like to have more pie. Well, as we kind of have talked about this, success and some backlash as a result of women's rights, what message would you like to send not only to women and girls listening to this, but all of the aspiring leaders listening to this?
I would say pay attention to what's happening to women's rights right now, because it is going to destabilize societies in a big way. It's also women are bearing the brunt of all of the intersecting crises that this world of ours is going through right now. So whether that's the climate-related migration, the conflicts, all of that, women are the most vulnerable, women and children. And so in part, it's a protection agenda, but more importantly, it's an empowerment agenda, because women, despite, I've seen this with my own eyes and in my own interactions with women around the world, despite them being in extremely difficult circumstances, are very resilient. But we can no longer count on them just for that and say, oh, they're resilient, they'll cope. It's time for us now to step up and say that the rights that they've been denied, or the stuff that's now being eroded, needs to be built back. So it requires courage. I mean, I'll say to you that, the forces we're up against are massive. They're often deeply embedded in government or led by authoritarian rulers. They are, and those people are sort of reconstructing institutions to fit their ideology, which is anti-gender equality and women's rights. And so it needs a lot of courage to step up and confront that. And ordinary women within their own circumstances have shown that courage. A colleague of mine, who Verena Winder, who was also in the Office of Global Women's Issues with us, has had this saying that she said, courage has two daughters. One is anger and the other is hope. So to have courage, you have to feel a deep-seated anger about the injustice of what you're, seeing. But simultaneously, you have to hold on to the hope, because otherwise the anger can drown you. You have to believe that change is possible. And I derive that hope and talk to many young women to tell them that you have to derive that hope from the fact that we've seen transformation at scale happen in the past, which gives me hope that it can always happen again. When the women's movement was strong, when we gathered across countries to create this momentum for change, 189 countries signed on. So how did we do that then? How can we replicate it now?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of countries and institutions have kind of recognized that progress, and they've seen economic benefit and they've seen broader benefit to their society. And I think that I always think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, particularly, of looking at there's two ways societies can change. Either it can kind of come from a legal system, it can come from the government saying, we see the benefit in this, it is time that this moves forward.
Right.
Or it can come from society.
Right.
And while unfortunately we're not seeing that from our institutions, I do think that we see a lot of people that are demanding it as people and as a society.
Yes. And you're right that, sometimes you see it from the top down through changes in laws and policies, but often those changes in laws and policies come because of the demand from the people. And you need both to happen.
Yes. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the many transitions you've made throughout your career. I know you've held positions in philanthropy, research, diplomacy. I'd really love to hear how you kind of navigated some of those transitions throughout your career.
So you're right that I've been in many different worlds and different kinds of organizations, and that was with intent. I wanted to, once I'd experienced the nonprofit world, and I was in the International Center for Research on Women for almost 20 years, 13 of which I was president, I could have just stayed on, but I decided I really wanted to experience what it was like in other kinds of institutions. The philanthropy experience I had was very brief. It was for a year in the Gates Foundation. I was a senior fellow in global development there. And it was a fabulous experience because I was like a fly on the wall. I was in an advisory capacity. I didn't have a program to execute, but I could watch the way in which decisions were made and strategies were laid out. And that was really enlightening and a huge learning experience for me. And then I went on to UNICEF, which is a very large, bureaucratic, United Nations organization, multilateral. There was a lot to learn. What I took with me for each of these transitions was my substantive knowledge, my technical knowledge of international development and women's contribution and place in that sphere. And so that technical knowledge sort of gave me the confidence I needed to try and understand different kinds of organizations and how they functioned. Because each organization has its own set of rules and its own norms, and it takes a while to figure those out. Government, for me, was perhaps the biggest challenge and I had the shortest time, to figure it all out. But again, I felt like because I knew what my passion was, I knew what I was there to do, I knew that I had the technical skills to do it right. And essentially, I was my authentic self. I was who I am in each of these jobs. I wasn't trying to be who the others were. And I think that's a big lesson for me that I have taken away from having had these opportunities. That was what helped me cope, is to be authentic and to say what I didn't know when I didn't know it, to learn, to inquire, to be curious, to listen, and then to use the knowledge that I had to advance whatever it was the mission of the organization that I worked for.
I really like that you brought up authenticity, because I've talked a little bit about that and kind of my journey with that, which I think can be kind of challenging as like a young female in a field where you don't necessarily feel as confident. Imposter syndrome is a real challenge. And also kind of having some of the backlash that's going on of how do you manage being your authentic self while also feeling confident and strong and like you belong in a space.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's not easy. I learned it after a few years in my professional life. It's particularly difficult being an immigrant and a woman, trying to fit into a world where the norms were very different from where I grew up in India and where I worked. So I came to the US very late in life. And so compared to most Indians who come here to study and so on, my entire education, including my PhD, was from India. So I didn't have that as a network or as a basis for how things function in the work world. So there was a lot of learning, a lot of mistakes that I made, a lot of funny stories that I can tell you someday, Nora, of the things that I did wrong. But it was exciting. It was an adventure because there was so much to learn and so much to do. So I enjoyed it.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about kind of this multiple sector experience that you had, really looking at kind of coalition building. As you know, we talked a little bit earlier about movements. I'd really love to hear like how your work in all of these different other spaces has helped you build inclusive and effective coalitions.
So the biggest lesson on coalitions I learned through my work on HIV/AIDS. In the early years of the pandemic, when the US Agency for International Development invested in trying to find out what would help in terms of prevention in the global south, I was given the opportunity to lead a program on women in AIDS. And I remember that, it required for women to be protected in the epidemic, required normative change. It required social norms to shift so that women could negotiate protection, so women could have enough independence to be able to step out of relationships that they believed to be risky. And to bring about that kind of normative change, I realized had to happen within communities. Mm-hmm. And it had to involve conversations across many different constituencies. So at the local level, in the community, whether it's the tribal chief and the women, some who are older, some who are younger, all with different sort of levels of power in that particular community, needed to talk to each other to figure out what was the best way to protect their community from this deadly disease. Simultaneously, we needed a global community of people sort of making the case for attention and resources to be put to this issue. And that took some incredible coalition building. The one that I was most touched by and learned a lot from is how the gay men's movement here in the US stood up for women's protection and women getting access to medication and to the tools that they needed to protect themselves in the global south. So for me to be able to interact with the gay men's movement that was fighting for resources to be put into HIV prevention and treatment, and link that to a global women's movement to protect women from HIV was incredible to see happen. But coalition building requires effort. It requires bringing people together. One of the disadvantages we have right now in the women's movement, in the face of this backlash and pushback, is that we have started becoming sort of operating in silos within the women's movement, either by issue and not just operating in silos, but sort of treating each other as if we don't all belong to the same community, right? We apply artificial litmus tests to women. Are you feminist enough or not? Do you really represent this issue, or is this just because you're from the global north, is this different from what we've experienced in the global south? At a time when we all need to come together, there's in fact a lot of divisive rhetoric that exists. And I feel that one of the ways to really stand up against what we're experiencing right now is to come together in coalition and to recognize that we are all part of this large tent. We don't have to necessarily lose our specialization or our passion for our particular issue. We have to recognize that all of us are headed in the same direction. We're all essentially for justice and equality. And so to sort of accept that and work together towards those larger goals, then sort of hold us back through these differences. And I think that is coalition building at its best. And that's what I'm at the moment actually very involved in trying to do.
Well, I'd love to hear more about what you're actively doing.
So I'm actually was one of the co-founders of two different initiatives. One is called the Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice, together with 7 other experts from the State Department, each of us sort of led a human rights portfolio when we were in the State Department. And when we stepped down, and all of us were political appointees, so we all stepped down together, we felt very strongly that we needed to come together to make the case for human rights to be centered within US foreign policy. And to do that by resisting the damage to that right now and holding the line as much as we could, while also thinking ahead and reimagining what a US foreign policy might look like that truly centered justice and human rights values. So that is one piece of work that I'm involved in that is very exciting, and it's a great group of women. The second is the Arch Collaborative that I'm doing with two other colleagues of mine, Verena Winder and Jessica Marcella. And that is really to try and figure out how to resist the pushback that we're experiencing right now and how to rebuild. So it's sort of what do we need to do now to rebuild for a future where we may have the opportunity to transform society again. So that's the effort that we're involved in. As you can imagine, in both those efforts, reaching out to other networks, building, sort of working in coalition with others who are interested in the same issues is incredibly important right now. So that's the stage we're in the Arch Collaborative in particular, where we're trying to figure out who are the partners we should be working with, who should we be bringing into the tent, and how can we best serve as a bridge, that's why the term Arch, between different constituencies, so that we recreate that momentum that we had in the global women's movement prior to Beijing.
I really love that. And I think it goes back a little bit to our conversation about intersectionality and like that intersection of, women's rights touches on so many different things.
Yes.
Because women are involved in so many different things. And I always think about it of kind of this, like, we talk about women's rights, but really it's the rights of over half the population of the world.
Yes.
And when you think about it that way, it kind of makes sense why it touches on so many different things. But the other thing I really liked, as you were bringing up kind of the coalition building, was looking at not only kind of how do we do damage control? How do we look at, what are we losing right now? And that includes what U.S. citizens are losing, because as we've talked a little bit about on this podcast, is the reason human rights were part of U.S. foreign policy for such a long time is because we were advocating for the rights of U.S. citizens globally. And we were also trying to protect those kind of fundamental principles that are part of the U.S.
I will say, though, Nora, that was the aspiration. I really don't think we had achieved it fully in U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy over the years has made many mistakes by sidelining human rights. And I think the effort we are engaged in right now, me and my 7 colleagues in the Alliance, is to try and imagine the world in which it wouldn't be a side after the fact kind of discussion about whether this has an impact on human rights, but we would be centered in everything related to U.S. foreign policy. Because I truly believe that with human rights as a significant part, as sort of the basic fundamental foundation of U.S. foreign policy, is the only way for us to achieve global stability, security. It has a lot to do with, for the common American, your own security, the economy, all of that is linked to what we do through our foreign policy. And that's the case we're trying to build.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that, like you said, the conversation has been, how do we kind of fit in human rights?
Exactly. Not how do we, exactly. How do we make it fundamental to everything we do in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I know this next question is going to be hard. It's probably the hardest one. Out of all of the many, many things you've done in your career, what is one of your proudest accomplishments? And you can say a couple. I'll be gracious.
That is a tough question. The single event that was the most transformative, that gave me the most confidence, and I think of the most surprising for me, was when I gave a plenary address at the International AIDS Conference in Durban in South Africa. And I remember preparing that talk on my own with data from the research project that we had done, but trying to make the case that gender inequality undermines both men and women. That was the first time, I didn't realize it was the first time, but that case was being made, because in the past we always talked about gender inequality as affecting, being disadvantageous to women, and certainly historically that's the legacy that women have borne the burden of, right? But in the context of HIV vulnerability, the norms of masculinity and femininity undermine both women and men and make them more vulnerable to HIV. And making that case to a plenary audience and watching the sort of aha moment in the audience, and then all of them, it was like 12,000 standing up and giving me a standing ovation, was my proudest moment. I just felt that all my research and all my thinking and learning along the way, that I had introduced something new into the field. So that's a single event. But by far the most proudest that I am is also about the fact that I was, nominated to be the ambassador for global women's issues, because this is the country that I adopted at the age of 30. So I came to this country late. I could never have imagined that anything like that would happen. In fact, when I got the call from the White House to say, I got an email to say, can we talk? I was certain they were calling me for suggestions of names for the position. So I had a list of 5 names. And the person at the other end said, no, I'm calling to ask if you're interested. And I thought, what? So that was incredible. That was an incredible feeling of that where could I better put to use the knowledge that I had gained and all that this country had given me than in that position to serve my government globally.
That's so beautiful. Makes me want to cry.
Me too.
Well, kind of the other side of that, what is one piece of advice you would like to give yourself as you were starting out your career?
Confidence, just believing in yourself, that you have something to give. It took me a long time to realize that, and got further undermined when we moved to the US and I had a career here in the US, because I just automatically felt that all these people with these fabulous degrees in universities in this country knew more than I did. And I would always surprise myself when something I said would add value to a discussion. And I wish I didn't feel that way as long as I did. I wish I had an inherent confidence that I had something to contribute. So if I were to go back and talk to my younger self, I would say, know that you can do it, be confident in what you know, and contribute that to whatever discussion happens, and that will be all that's required. Because I held back often.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect message. I'm going to take it now, not as my younger self, but today. And I hope our listeners also really take that advice and move forward, because I do think inherently as humans, we have this unique experience, we have unique skill sets, and just as much as you may be aspiring towards a certain goal, I think that goal needs you. Whether it's a position, an idea you have, a company you want to start, a podcast you want to launch.
Exactly. Each of us brings to the table a different set of experiences. And that's why diversity is so important, because it's not just diversity for the sake of diversity. It's because diversity brings different perspectives to a decision, makes the decision stronger, because you're hearing all sides of whatever the problem that is in front of you, on which you have to make a decision. So if you have everybody who's of one kind with the same kind of experience, you're not going to get the best solution.
Absolutely. I think there's not a better way to wrap up this podcast episode than really talking about not only diversity, but, when we look at diversity, look at women's rights, we're really looking at how we can all come together for a better future and a better now. I think a lot of times we talk about the future, but there's been so much data that's proven economically, politically, and from a kind of national security stability standpoint for global stability, that when we're all coming together, we're going to get stability that lasts longer, and we're going to get better economic longevity. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for joining us on
Thank
this
you.
episode.
Thanks so much, Nora, for
Table.
inviting me. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Of course, of course. And just for our viewers who are listening, please feel free to click that subscribe button so that you can stay tuned for amazing conversations like this. You can also reach out on Instagram, on TikTok. We're at the Head of the Table podcast. And we also have a LinkedIn page. So we can kind of create that discourse about the challenges you're facing in your career, how you want to step up as a leader, and more. So thank you so much for joining us today.